My name's Antony Eastmond. I'm the A.G. Leventis Professor of Byzantine Art at the Courtauld. Today I'm giving you a short taster lecture about Byzantine art, and in particular about iconoclasm, about the destruction of art, why and how people want to destroy works of art. So I will now share the screen and get going. So Byzantine art is the name we give to the art produced in the Eastern Mediterranean from the 4th to the 15th centuries, about 1,000 years in the history of art. It's best known for its religious art, the great mosaics in churches that you see here. So one on the left from about 1500 years ago, now in Thessaloniki, a riot of colour on a huge dome. And on the right, the great imposing and frightening image of Christ the God from the Church of Daphne, now on the outskirts of Athens. But Byzantium was also once famed for its secular art. So here you see a beautiful wood, bone and ivory box now in the V&A Museum in London that's covered in images from classical mythology. So here you see Bellerophon as a great naked hero from classical antiquity with the winged horse Pegasus. But relatively little of that luxury secular art survives. Most of what we have is religious, and that's why Byzantine art is known primarily as a religious art form. So we call this world and its art Byzantium, Byzantine, but those who made it thought that they were Romans. They thought they were working in the traditions of the Roman Empire. The only differences being, one, they were now Christian rather than pagan, although as you saw from that previous image, they were still interested in the myths and legends of the ancient world. They'd also moved. They were no longer Romans in Rome, in Italy, but they were now settled in a new capital, the city of Constantinople, better known today as Istanbul, the name it had since it was conquered by the Turks in 1453. And finally, rather than speaking Latin as the Romans had, they now had Greek as their main language. The most famous kind of art, what we most associate with Byzantium, is the icon. So icon is simply an English version of the Greek word icon, which just means an image. It can refer to anything, but we now primarily associate it with wooden panels or metal panels bearing images of the great figures of Christianity, as you can see here in some of the earliest icons to survive. Now in the monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, you can see on the left the great figure of Christ, and on the right you see Mary, his mother, with the Christ child, and saints on either side, probably Theodore and George, and two angels looking up to heaven in the background. So these are the great images of the Byzantine world, but they're also highly problematic ones. For there are many questions about what an icon actually is, how does it work, and what should it be used for? And these were debated throughout the millennium that the empire survived, but most particularly in the 8th and 9th centuries, precisely from the years 726 or 730 to the year 843, when there was what we might call a civil war about the status of images. And it's that we now call iconoclasm, the destruction of images. So what is it about images that makes them so important that people were prepared to torture, to exile, and even execute their rivals over their existence? This was a violent as well as a great intellectual exercise to work out what icons were. So primarily, an icon gives you access to enable you to commune with the divine. So just look at that figure of Christ on the left. So it gives you face-to-face contact with your God. Although if you look at it, you'll see he never quite seems to be looking directly back. he seems to be looking just over your shoulder, perhaps to something rather more important further away, to give you an idea of your importance in the hierarchy of existence. And the idea then is that you say a prayer to an icon, but it passes through the icon directly to the figure being represented. But the question that the Byzantines faced is, how do you tell the difference between an icon like those you see here or an idol, so the objects venerated by the pagans that preceded the Christians in the Roman Empire? So they thought that those pagans were merely worshipping matter. So the gold, the ivory, the bronze, the ebony, the marble of this statue here of Artemis, who's more like a column than a human being. How does that make it different from an icon, which is equally made of matter? Here, wood, gesso, plaster, and pigment. And the problem for a Christian obviously came from the Old Testament and the 10 Commandments, particularly the second commandment. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. For I am the Lord thy God, and I am a jealous God. So this then raises the question then of what role should art play in the Christian religion? And why did some people in the church fight so hard to have them? In the western half of Europe in this period, there wasn't the same debate. And indeed, the Pope in Rome at the end of the 6th century had written a letter to one of his fellow bishops in which he said, and put image art really in its place, saying, what scripture is to the educated, images are to the ignorant, who see through them what they must accept. They read in them what they cannot read in books. This idea that art is simply there as another way to tell stories. So this is in a world in the western half of Europe which is fragmented. The Roman Empire had fallen. We had lots of minor warring states. In the East, we're in a different world, and I think that made all the difference. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire, this continuation of the Roman world, was still ruled by a single figure, an emperor. And here on the screen, you see the colossal statue of Constantine the Great, really the first Byzantine emperor, the first Christian emperor from now in Rome. And for Constantine and the emperors immediately after him, they were happy to have Christianity, but they were also quite keen to maintain some of the good things from the old Roman Empire, most importantly, the cult of the emperor. And one of the bishops of the time at the beginning of the 4th century, Athanasius of Alexandria, set out the importance of art for an emperor when he wrote that for the likeness of the emperor in the image is exact. To one who, after viewing the image, wished to view the emperor, the image might say, but I and the emperor are one, for what you see in me, that you behold in him, and what you have seen in him, that you behold in me. Accordingly, he who worships the image also worships the emperor in it. So from this we can get two things. One is, in this mentality, in this view of the world, the image is as important as the emperor himself, because the image is the emperor. And given that this is a world which stretches all the way around the Mediterranean, the emperor can't be in many places at once. His image then becomes a stand-in for him. And also, we know from this that another important factor of these images is that the likeness has to be exact. Now, this isn't about photographic accuracy. I think if Constantine the Great were to walk down the street, we wouldn't recognize him as looking like that colossal image, which is highly idealized, making him look, noble, strong, and so on. But it is about everyone having an agreed idea of what the emperor should be like. And this then will lead over the centuries to one of the main issues that people face when studying Byzantine art, which is why all icons seem to look the same. So if I start with a 6th century image of the Virgin and Child and then trace it through to the 15th century, then perhaps beyond into the West with the Bellini portrait in the National Gallery, you can see one of the most important things about this art is its need for consistency, for the prayer to be able to reach the saint. The image must bear the likeness of the people being portrayed. And so you have this great consistency in how images are being treated, to the extent that icons are effectively being treated like people, which maybe explain why the icon bottom right, a modern icon, again in the same tradition, needs to be wearing her seatbelt. So in this debate in the 8th century about the veracity of images coming out of the Old Testament 10 Commandments, religion and theology lay at the heart of the issues. Is it right to disobey that commandment? But I think there were many other problems and issues that we can see lying behind it as well, to do with morality and to do with politics and so on. So to take one modern example, here you see photographs before and after of the great Buddha at Bamiyan in Afghanistan, destroyed by the Taliban in the year 2001. This was almost universally condemned in the West as being a terrible sacrilege of cultural heritage. But to an Islamic mindset in a country where there were no Buddhists to venerate this huge object, it's more than 55 meters tall, it felt right and it accorded with their religion to destroy it. So we condemn it. To them, it was the right thing. But there have been times in the past where Christians have thought it right to destroy images. When the Spanish invaded Mexico in the 15th and 16th centuries, one of the things they did was to attack the indigenous religions. And here you see from a manuscript about the province of Tlaxcala in Mexico, written in the 1580s by Diego Muñoz Camargo, a bonfire of all the idols of the Tlaxcalans. So they were rivals of the Aztecs in Mexico. And you can see them happily burning all their idols away. And what was their justification? Well, it seems quite a good one, I think, to us. Here's another page from the same book showing two rather, I think, self-satisfied and rather fat-looking Spanish conquistadors looking on at human sacrifice. Now, is it not worth destroying those idols, they would say, in order to erase such barbarous practices? Let's put aside what the conquistadors themselves were doing to the indigenous populations at the time. But it's also interesting when you look at this image to see how carefully recorded it is. They want to destroy the old religion, but also at the same time, they also want us to remember it. Look how carefully each of the different idols of the Tlaxcalans is recorded. This isn't just about forgetting an old religion, but it's about remembering to forget it as well. And that's something I think we can find in many of the current debates we're having about art and its destruction. So here we see Cecil Rhodes on the outside of Oriel College, Oxford, on the left, still in place, despite the governing board of the college saying they'd take it down. On the right, Edward Colston, very decisively toppled from his statue in 2021, and now on display in a very different way in the museum in Bristol. So here we've got statues under attack, not because we wish to venerate them, at least I don't think anyone does, but because of their associations with things we now find morally repugnant. So slavery and particularly Rhodes' racist exploitation of the southern states of Africa. And this desire to topple the political and the political power we accord to statues. Why do we want to get rid of these unless we think there's a value that resides in them that we wish to erase? And I think there's something similar in Byzantium too, which put that tension. If you regard the statue of the emperor as the emperor himself, then what would it mean to topple a statue of it? And this is something that we can trace back into the Roman Empire itself. So here are two images of the family of the emperor Septimius Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century. So a painted panel, a very rare survival from the Roman world, on the left, and a panel from the Arch of the Money Changers in Rome on the right. And you might be able to observe in both that something is missing. Here on the tondo, most obviously, the face of Septimius Severus's son, Geta, who opposed his father and was executed as a result, has been obliterated. It's slightly more subtle, but if you look on the right-hand side of the panel from the Arch of the Money Changers, you can see something has been hacked away and not replaced. Again, this was the image of the son. So not only is he obliterating the memory of an opponent, but he wants us to know that he has the power to do it. We will remember to forget Geta forever after. And we can see something similar in Byzantine iconoclasm as well, in cases where here, as in a church now in Jordan from 718, their way of destroying the figures in the mosaic, so this is on the floor of the church, was to pick up all the tesserae, the individual marble cubes from which the mosaic was made, jumble them up and put them back in. We're clearly able to recognize that there were figures here. They're even still named. Here is John, the son of John. But their likenesses have been removed. In Hagia Sophia, the great main church of the Byzantine Empire in the heart of Constantinople, so modern day Istanbul, the same happened, but in a slightly more subtle way. Here's a mosaic that was removed in 768 and replaced just with an image of a cross. And we know it's been replaced and must once have had an image of a saint in it, because down below you can see the tesserae have also been removed and replaced. And this must have been the name, Hagios, the saint something or other, and the name was there, but that has been removed and all just replaced with gold tesserae, golden cubes, and the face has been removed. So other reasons to destroy art lie not so much directly in politics, but in ideas about morality and the rectitude of art. So here are two things that you can see in London, very close to the Courtaulds' home in Somerset House. So on the left, you see what is now Zimbabwe House on the Strand, very close to Trafalgar Square. And on the right is the Rokeby Venus by Velázquez, painted in the 1640s and now in the National Gallery. You see the image of Zimbabwe House, what used to be the house of the British Medical Association, as it was soon after it was built, in perfect condition. But if I now overlay both images, you can see what happened to them both in the early 20th century. The Rokeby Venus was attacked by Mary Richardson, a suffragette, who slashed it with an axe, and the statues on Zimbabwe House by Jacob Epstein were all smashed in the 1930s. So they were attacked in the 1930s, but they'd been under attack from moralists from the time they were set up in 1908. So just read you a quote. Can you imagine getting away with this these days? This is from Father Bernard Vaughan of something called the National Vigilance Society in 1908. As a Christian citizen in a Christian city, I claim the right to say that I object most emphatically to such indecent and inartistic statuary being thrust upon my view. He had the misfortune that his office was on the Strand opposite this building. And he was supported by the London's newspaper, the Evening Standard, which complained that Jacob Epstein had erected a form of statuary which no careful father would wish his daughter, or no discriminating young man, his fiancée, to see. What delicate people they were back at the beginning of the 20th century. So here, Jacob Epstein's statues, the nudity of the men and the women, his desire to treat them as both young and beautiful, but also old and not so beautiful, became the subject of a reason to attack them. For Mary Richardson, it was because of the government's attacks on Mrs. Pankhurst, the leader of the suffragettes. And she complained in court that she said that justice is an element of beauty as much as colour and outline on canvas. So she was getting back in an attack on injustice by attacking art that came with it. So in the end, they claimed that they had to hack off the statues by Epstein on safety grounds after they said one of the heads fell on the ground and nearly killed someone. But lurking behind it were many other moralistic views about art and its appropriateness in public. Now, all these motives and anxieties about art can be found in Byzantine arguments that bring together the theological, the political, the moral and social concerns about art. But I think in Byzantium, they also responded to another more immediate concern, which also was about the power of art. And that was the rise of a new religion, the religion of Islam. So this is the map I showed you earlier, showing out the rough layout of the world in 624 with the Byzantine Empire covering most of the Eastern Mediterranean, north and south. So Western Europe has been lost to the Roman Empire and divided between minor states. To the east, in what's modern day Iran, Iraq, was also subject to a major empire. This is the Sasanian Empire, whereas down in what's now Saudi Arabia, a man called Muhammad had just started to preach his new religion of Islam from the city of Medina. So that's the state of the world in around 624. Look at it just a century on. Islam has come to dominate the southern Mediterranean and all of the Near and Middle East. It's pushed the Byzantine frontier back, and indeed for about 6 years in the 670s and the 710s, they were at the gates of Constantinople itself, besieging the city, although they never managed to capture it. They were also slowly attacking Europe from the west and had conquered almost all of Spain by this period. So you can imagine at the beginning of the 8th century, the people in Constantinople, the members of the Byzantine Empire, were wondering what they were doing wrong and what Islam was doing right to have such rapid and extraordinary success. And one of the things they could do was to look to the Islamic attitude towards God. And here we have very early evidence. So from Hijra 72, so from just 72 years after Muhammad's pilgrimage out of Medina towards Mecca, so 72 years into a new religion, we have one of the great world monuments being created for it, the Dome of the Rock, the great Islamic shrine on top of the site of the old Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So 72 Hijra equates in the Common Era to 691 to 2, and it was built by Abd al-Malik, one of the members of the first great Islamic dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty. So at this point, Islam is a very young religion, and this monument was almost certainly built by people from within the Byzantine Empire, by their craftsmen. Because how is it made? It's made out of great slabs of marble and mosaic, the great media and the great craftsmanship associated with the Byzantine world. And if you look at its mosaics, again, full of gold tesserae, so these small cubes of glass with sheets of gold in them, there is a lot here that resembles what we're used to seeing from Byzantium, but with one major exception. There are no images of people here. Here and in the next surviving monument, the Great Mosque in Damascus, built at the very beginning of the 8th century, we have the same thing. There it's bucolic landscapes. Here it's kind of images of the flowers and the trees of paradise. And this idea that Islam, which in Christian eyes to begin with just seemed like a kind of heretical offshoot of Christianity, was so politically and militarily successful, whilst it forbade religious images, and Byzantium was becoming, it seemed, much less successful whilst it adhered to them, became one more reason why it was at this moment in the 8th century that this battle about the status of images became so important. Now, by the middle of the 9th century, that Islamic threat had receded. The Byzantine Empire had weathered the storm, had begun to re-expand to the east once more. And in the end, the promoters, the ProImage Party, won the battle, with the result that from the middle of the 9th century on, we find images being introduced once again, perhaps the most famous being the huge mosaic of the Mother of God and the Christ child, again made in gold mosaic, that was set up in the apse of Hagia Sophia, the great central church of the empire, which still survives, now turned back into a mosque again in Istanbul in Turkey. So here you see the exterior, so built in the 530s, the largest building in the world for nearly 1,000 years after it was built, and its extraordinary construction of semi-domes and semi-domes and domes, which just seems to float above you. So the Virgin is at this height at the other end of the building, so she's about 30 meters off the ground, to give you an idea of the scale. So we have this idea then that in the middle of the 9th century, images were legitimized once again. It comes both as a religious thing, but also in other forms as a slightly political image full of propaganda. These are 2 pages from a very small personal book of the Psalms, so from the Old Testament. It's only about 15 to 20 centimeters high, but in it an artist has been very innovative in comparing those who tried to attack icons. So here you see the leader of the anti-icon faction is whitewashing an icon of Christ, and he's being compared to the Roman soldiers and the Jews who the Christians at the time blamed for the crucifixion of Christ himself. And on another page, here you see the emperor who supported the destruction of images, presiding over a council that declared them to be illegal, and he's beginning to drown in blood, and you can see blood pouring out from the page itself. And of course, this is a manuscript made out of calf skin, so it's actually a literal skin that is bleeding here to drown those who oppose images, whilst rising up above them is a great saint who is promoting images. And if we just go back to John the Grammarian here, the leader of the anti-icon faction, you can see not only was he caricatured with spiky hair, an obvious sign of evil, but later readers of the book have tried to rub out his face whenever they're using it. So that idea of remembering to forget and attacking images in now in a very different way has survived over the centuries. So I hope that's a taste, just an introduction to the Byzantine world and its particular interest in the politics of images that starts here in the 7th century, but as you can see, resounds around the world today. So thank you very much.